haven't seen this talked about much anywhere online. Maybe I haven't been looking too thoroughly, but not many people know of a forgotten French film, French animation, that Miyazaki himself stated that inspired him greatly. And in my opinion, greatly inspired his last feature film, The Boy and the Heron. I wanted to kind of present the similarities between the two and maybe how you decide what you think. But I do think that he took a lot of inspiration from that particular animation, seeing that he loved it so much. The guy rarely gives out interviews, but on this one chance that he gave an interview to Nigel Andrews, the film critic and longtime chief of the Financial Times, a long time ago, Miyazaki mentioned that he was greatly inspired by this blend of innocence and apocalypse, took some inspiration from a lot of Soviet animation, George Orwell's Animal Farm, Alice in Wonderland, saying that he loves Lewis Carroll and is certain that a lot of his work, ideas of Lewis Carroll seeps into his films, and that he is greatly influenced by his work. But also one French animation called La Bergère et le Larmoneur by Paul Grimault, or The Shepherdess and the Chimney Sweep. It doesn't exist under that name anymore because it was remade later on and renamed Le Roi l'Oiseau, or The King and the Bird as the direct translation, or the English name The King and the Mockingbird. And I wanted to kind of tell you a little bit about that animation and why I find it fascinating, and show you just a bunch of similarities between The Boy and the Heron, or君たちはどう生きるか, and that one. Miyazaki himself is not a great fan of forced moral lessons, or doesn't like art that gives moralizing lectures, so he stays himself. So I'll try to avoid that and rather just show you the similarities and maybe convince you to watch it. Yeah, so I'll start with some similarities that I found between these two particular films, and then show you a few similarities between Miyazaki's style in general that I think is prevalent throughout a bunch of other films. But I'll start with specifically The Boy and the Heron. Mainly the castles and architecture within both animations. There is this very European-esque castle-like structure that is the centerpiece of both of the films at some point. Le Roi l'Oiseau, it has this discombobulated geometric feel to it, as though it's composed of a bunch of different separate parts. It's made of this like white-ish brick stone. Seems as though it's just kind of a pile of different geometric shapes, with this very castle-like European tiling and roofs. For Miyazaki, the first entrance into this kind of castle-like structure, where the heron kind of brings him to this castle, also has this kind of European castle-looking structure, also quite tall. You have these hallways of many, many rooms, many different doorways. Another point to make is at the very end, when the wizard that runs this castle in君たちはどう生きるか, he builds stuff out of stones of a very, very similar kind of color and texture as the one in Le Roi l'Oiseau. Again, just something I noticed. Additionally, they both start with some sort of alarm and then the death of one of the characters. So for Kimi tachi wa dou ikiru ka, it's the Mahito's mother's death in the fire. And for Le Roi l'Oiseau, it's the death of the bird's wife. It's not the death, it's just a gravestone, and he mentions how chase and being killed by the king and how that led to her death. Although Le Roi l'Oiseau has this opening a bit later, after a monologue in the beginning. Another thing is, for both of the two films, their titles, at least the non-Japanese titles, seem to be very similar. So Le Roi l'Oiseau, or The King and the Bird, versus The Boy and the Heron in the English translation, in the Russian translation, and pretty sure in many other translations. Though the Japanese title of it, Kimi tachi wa dou ikiru ka, or How Do You Live, is the name of, one of Miyazaki's favorite books when he was younger, I do think there is some sort of connection between the way they ended up translating it to a bunch of different other languages and the French animation title. But Kimi tachi wa dou ikiru ka, the book, is quite nice. I heard, or I listened to an audiobook of it for just a few minutes and just to see how it sounds, and it slightly reminded me of Le Petit Prince, or The Little Prince, in terms of the difficulty of language. And I maybe sometime later I would listen to it or read it fully, just because it did seem to have that similar sentiment of Le Petit Prince, which I quite like. But yeah, that's side note. Also, both films have great connection to the Second World War, meaning that for Kimi tachi wa dou ikiru ka, for The Boy and the Heron, it's set during World War II, and then at the end it's like post-World War II, with Mahito's father creating aircraft parts for a factory, similar to Miyazaki's own father, who built aircraft parts for World War II, so kind of that too. And for Le Roi l'Oiseau, it was started being made right after World War II, so it's being conceived in 1946, and then it was fully released with the updated version, because before it was La Bergère or Le Rameneur, but now it's Le Roi l'Oiseau, and that was significantly after World War II. But regardless, there's this kind of overarching theme with having one dictatorial and hierarchical structure within both films, more or less, and having a definite presence of destruction towards the end, which is another part that I wanted to mention, how both of them have to, at the very end, just kind of collapse. The world that is built is completely destroyed. So for Le Roi l'Oiseau, it was this castle, and then the robot came and completely demolished everything, and all of the villagers left to start anew. The ending scene, even with the caged bird, the bird flies away, and then the robot smashes the trap that was left. For Kimi tachi wa dou ikiru ka, the very end, the castle that was created from the meteorite, that was completely demolished. Everybody returned to the real world and not the one built. There are even smaller parts. So even the character designs of the big bird in Miyazaki's film, who tries to ask the creator of the world for power of some sort, that character design really seems to resemble the character design of the king in Le Roi l'Oiseau. They both have this curly mustache, they both have a red, they have the crown. I mean, far-reaching, but also the fact that the heron also kind of resembles. They're both plump, they have that shaped beak with the heron and l'oiseau, especially in the more human form, the heron. Also, another smaller part was the fact that with both films, there are two characters in La Bergère et Le Rameneur, which the shepherdess and the chimney sweep, they travel via chimney to get to another destination, to escape at some point. Much like in Le Roi Kimi tachi wa dou ikiru ka, there they also travel via chimney, but with Hime's fire capabilities. But also the fact that Le Rameneur and La Bergère, they come from different paintings in Le Roi l'Oiseau, and they come from these separate worlds, and much like Le Roi, he also comes from a different painting. They come from different universes, much like Hime and Mahito and the creator of the world. They also come from different timelines within the doors, and they all come from these long hallways or paintings. This is kind of visually very similar, I find, with different timelines overlapping within one building being the centerpiece. But also that's not the only, there are other smaller things that seem to reflect, with traps being one of the prevalent things within the very beginning of Kimi tachi wa dou ikiru ka, where it's known that the heron is bringing him into this trap into the building, where with the heading of Fecemi la divina potestate. Within Le Roi l'Oiseau, the traps are mentioned oftentimes because the birds are being trapped all the time, and that's kind of the promise of escaping this trap towards the very end, where it's being smashed. Another very small bit, I'm not even sure if it should count, but in both cases, in Le Roi l'Oiseau, they travel by water. The king and his horsemen travel by water in a very Venice resembling places. They even have a lot of the architecture from Venice. And they travel on these fish on the water on the lowest level of this like structure. Much like on the lowest level of the structure when Mahito first arrives, there's like these oceans and oceans. They travel by boat and by fish. And to show you how it resembles Miyazaki's style in general, I think there are also a few points that he kind of took inspiration from Le Roi l'Oiseau, I find it. The fact that there's this, the robot that destroys everything, but in the French one it's more like a destroyer. In Miyazaki, for like Nausicaa, it's the Titan, who also like has a similar, not necessarily design, but kind of like purpose, like a massive creature that destroys everything. It's robot-like, being controlled by something. Or even in Laputa, where it's the robot that accompanies the two characters. But also in Laputa, the same kind of destruction and renewal of everything. They have the complete collapse of Laputa, and they return to their island, or how the world collapses in Le Roi l'Oiseau. Or even the flying machines. They are very similar to the one flying machine in Le Roi l'Oiseau, where they also kind of have the same kind of structure and the same kind of design. It's just a lot of similarities, I find. But also within that animation, and most Miyazaki animations, which everybody notices, is this kind of pure dead silence that is present in many points. And Le Roi l'Oiseau has a lot of those parts where it's no music, nothing, it's just complete and utter silence, which is you don't see too often. So those are a few parts that I thought were particularly interesting and very similar. So yeah, give it a watch, see what you think. I know it's accessible on Internet Archives, except with Spanish subtitles, or with English subtitles that are a bit earlier than the actual animation, or the animation scene. So if you're up for learning French, that's a great way of doing it. So yeah, and there's that. Watch The Boy and the Heron in a bought version, or go into theaters. I think it's running still. But yeah, let me know what you think. Side note, I got a copyright strike, so my other video with the Следствие ведут колобки was kind of blocked for now. Hopefully that'll be over, but maybe I'll have to redo it. We'll see. Yeah. Oh, another side note. So, did anybody think that for the Wada Wada creatures in君たちはどう生きるか, they kind of looked like the Doctor Who episode with the fat rising up? I just thought that was funny, but yeah.